He said it with a smile on his face. A smile. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. There she was, Jade Rivers, a black woman, brilliant, composed, carrying herself through that third-floor office with the kind of quiet grace that filled every room she entered without asking permission. 2 years. 2 years of precision, of loyalty, of knowing more than she was supposed to know and staying anyway. And this man in his royal blue suit, with his inherited money and his borrowed confidence, looked at her the way people look at things they believe they can buy. And he smiled. "Name your price for the black girl." He actually said those words, out loud, in front of her. In front of the one man in that building who had spent 23 months building a wall around everything he felt every single time she walked into a room. And that wall came down in seconds. What happened next, no one in that office was prepared for. Not Chad Whitmore, who walked in thinking he was the most powerful man in the room. Not Jade, who had been waiting 2 years for a truth that neither of them had been willing to say out loud. And certainly not the open window on the 3rd floor that was about to become very relevant. Because the Korean Mafia boss behind that desk, the man with the dragon tattooed up his neck, the man who had survived things that would have ended lesser men, he did not reach for words. He reached for Chad Whitmore's lapels. What came next changed everything. For all 3 of them. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There are offices that feel like waiting rooms for something that hasn't happened yet. You walk in, you smell the recycled air, you hear the low hum of fluorescent lights doing their job without complaint. And somewhere, underneath all of that ordinary sound, there is a stillness that has weight. Not the stillness of emptiness, the stillness of something held, something pressed down with both hands for a very long time. The building on Clearwater Drive sat at the edge of a suburban commercial strip in the kind of neighborhood that Atlanta produces in abundance. Half-developed, quietly prosperous, the sort of place where businesses arrive without announcement and occasionally disappear the same way. 3 floors, tinted windows, a parking lot that was never quite full enough to suggest the building was thriving, never quite empty enough to suggest it was abandoned. A bronze plaque beside the entrance read, "Sung Global Imports," in letters that were tasteful and completely uninformative. There were cameras above every entrance. People who noticed them tended not to mention it. Park Sung-jin had chosen this location the same way he chose everything, with precision that looked like indifference. He had stood in the empty building 4 years ago, walked every floor alone, looked out the 3rd-floor window at the unremarkable skyline, and decided that unremarkable was exactly what he needed. His actual work happened in places that did not have addresses. This office existed to have an address, to receive mail, to give reporters and tax authorities something to look at, while everything that mattered occurred 3 layers beneath the surface of any document they would ever find. He had built a life on the discipline of concealment. Not dishonesty. He would correct that distinction if anyone had ever been foolish enough to raise it. Concealment. The strategic management of what was visible and what was not. He had learned it young, refined it through years of operating in spaces where the wrong expression at the wrong moment cost more than money. And by 36, he wore it as naturally as the black suit that arrived pressed and waiting on his chair every morning. He was very good at concealment. He was not as good at it as he believed. The problem had a name. The problem had honey-warm skin and a gold moon pendant and the kind of walk that made the marble floor sound like a red carpet, regardless of what she was carrying or where she was going. The problem had been hired 23 months ago after 3 other candidates failed to last 90 days. One because she could not manage his schedule, one because she asked too many questions about shipment manifests, and one because she seemed frightened of him, which he found professionally useless and personally exhausting. Jade Rivers had not been frightened of him. Not on the first day, not during the first week when she quietly restructured his filing system without asking permission. Not during the second month when one of his associates arrived at the office at 11 at night unannounced, and she opened the door, looked the man over with those amber eyes, and said, "He's expecting you. Don't touch anything on the way in." She had not been afraid. She had been, and this was the word that Sung Jin had never permitted himself to finish, she had been entirely, completely, and inconveniently herself. That Thursday afternoon began the way most Thursday afternoons began. She walked in at 2:15, carrying the folder for the 3 o'clock meeting, her heels marking a clean rhythm down the corridor. Her black tailored trousers moving the way expensive fabric moves when the person wearing it has the kind of posture that cannot be taught. The white button-up was tucked precisely. The gold cord at her throat caught the light from the corridor sconces. She knocked twice on the glass door. Her knock, always 2, never 3, and entered before he responded because she had learned in the first week that his silence meant come in, not wait. He was at the window. He was often at the window in the hour before difficult meetings. She had long since stopped interpreting it as anxiety. He did not do anxiety. It was calculation. He was running the variables before the conversation started, arranging outcomes in order of likelihood, deciding which version of himself to present and which to keep behind the glass. She placed the folder on his desk. Clean placement, not slid, not dropped. Set down like it belonged there. The documents for the 3 o'clock. He did not turn immediately. The city beyond the glass was doing nothing interesting. A truck on the access road, a bird crossing the pale sky. Nothing worth watching. He was not watching it. Jade. One word. Her name. He said it the way you say the name of something you are trying not to look at directly. Yes, Mr. Park? He turned. The full sweep of his gaze moved over her in the way it always did, starting at her face, traveling briefly and completely, returning to her face. 1 second longer than professional. 1 second that he had never eliminated despite every intention to do so. Chad Whitmore will arrive at 3. Stay at reception. She processed the name. Chad Whitmore. Whitmore Properties. She had come across the name twice in documents she was not supposed to have read thoroughly, and had read thoroughly, because reading things thoroughly was how she had stayed useful for 23 months in an environment where people who were not useful tended to quietly stop appearing. I know the name. The reputation isn't good. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A fraction of a degree. But she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything about him, without appearing to. Stay at reception, he said again. The repetition was not redundancy. It was decision. She left, and he stood at the window for 30 more seconds after the sound of her heels disappeared, doing something he was very practiced at not doing. He was thinking about her. Not about the meeting. Not about Whitmore and the debt and the negotiation he had already rehearsed in 3 variations. About the way the gold pendant had moved when she turned, and the 2 syllables of her name in his own voice, and the particular discipline it required every single morning to sit across from someone who carried that much gravity and behave as though the room were level. He had built his entire adult life on the management of desire. The desire for power, the desire for safety, the desire to burn every rival structure to the ground and build something permanent in the space where it stood. Those desires he had trained like animals. They obeyed. They served him. This one had not obeyed. This one sat in the corner of everything he did and watched him with patient amber eyes and waited. He straightened his cufflinks. He opened the folder she had left. He read the first page without retaining a single word. Downstairs, the bronze front door opened at 15:07, and Chad Whitmore arrived in the lobby trailing expensive cologne and the specific energy of a man who had spent 44 years having rooms accommodate themselves to his presence. He was wide-shouldered, fair-haired, dressed in a royal blue 3-piece that cost more than most people's monthly rent and fit him the way money fits people who have never had to think about money. Comfortably, unapologetically, slightly too much. He stopped at the base of the staircase. The elevator was out, a placard explained. Maintenance. And he looked up 3 flights with an expression that was almost annoyance, and then decided against it. He climbed. He was breathing normally when he reached the 3rd floor. He noted this about himself with private satisfaction. And then he saw her. Jade Rivers was at the reception desk, her attention on the monitor, her profile lit by the afternoon light coming through the half-shuttered blinds. The curve of her shoulder, the fall of black hair over the left side of her neck. The way she tilted her head slightly when reading, which brought the gold pendant forward against her skin. Chad Whitmore adjusted his tie. He crossed the reception area toward her with the stride of a man who had decided something in the previous 10 seconds, and he said in a voice that had been calibrated since adolescence to land precisely between confident and charming. "Good afternoon. I didn't know Mr. Park had hired something like this." Jade raised her eyes from the screen with the unhurried pace of someone who had heard 1,000 versions of that sentence and found all of them equally predictable. She smiled. It was a remarkable smile. Warm enough to be welcoming, precise enough to be a tool. "Mr. Whitmore, he's expecting you." She rose from the chair in one fluid movement. "Right this way." Chad followed. Of course he followed. And upstairs, behind the glass door of the 3rd floor corner office, Park Sung-jin heard the sound of 2 sets of footsteps in the corridor. Her heels, and the heavier, slower tread of someone who did not yet understand where he had arrived. And he set the folder down, folded his hands on the desk, and waited. The dragon tattoo was still on his neck. It always was. The door opened the way doors open when someone has decided the room already belongs to them. Chad Whitmore entered with his shoulders back and his smile deployed like a flag planted in new territory. The leather portfolio tucked under his left arm, his right hand already extended across the distance between himself and the desk, as though the handshake were a formality that the other man should feel grateful to receive. He moved through the office the way he moved through every room he entered, assessing it for comfort, finding it acceptable, and immediately beginning the unconscious process of making it his own. He did not find the office particularly impressive. He had expected something more. The furniture was good. Dark wood, clean lines, nothing ostentatious. But it was restrained in a way that read to Chad as either taste or limitation, and he had not yet decided which. The view from the 3rd floor window was suburban and unremarkable. A framed print on the east wall that he could not identify. No trophies, no photographs, no evidence of ego on any surface. This, had he understood the man sitting across from him, would have told him everything. Park Sung-jin did not decorate with evidence of himself. Men who needed the room to announce them had already lost something. He accepted the handshake. His grip was brief and complete. He gestured to the chair across the desk without standing, which was a choice, and Chad registered it as rudeness without considering that it might be something more deliberate than that. "Whitmore," Sung-jin said. Not a greeting, a confirmation of identity. "Park." Chad settled into the chair with the easy sprawl of someone making himself comfortable in a space that had not invited comfort. He set the portfolio on the desk without asking. "Good to finally do this in person. I kept telling your people, some conversations need to happen face to face." "Some conversations do," Sung-jin agreed. He opened the folder Jade had prepared. The numbers were on the first page, clean and organized, the way she did everything. "We can have this one in about 12 minutes if you came prepared." Chad laughed. The laugh was social lubricant, applied generously. "Straight to it. I respect that." He opened his own portfolio. "Look, I know there's a number on the table. I'm not here to pretend it doesn't exist. I'm here because I think we have an opportunity to restructure this in a way that benefits both of us. The Hargrove development alone is going to generate the Hargrove permits are frozen," Sung-jin said. He had not looked up from the folder. "Have been for 6 weeks.
The county commissioner who was expediting them is under federal review. That revenue projection doesn't exist." A beat of silence. Chad's smile recalibrated by a degree.
"That situation is temporary. My attorneys
are billing you $400 an hour to tell you what you already know." Sung-jin looked up then. The dark eyes were flat and patient and gave nothing.
"The number is what it is, Whitmore. The timeline is what it is. What I need from you today is a plan that reflects current reality, not projected reality."
Chad leaned back. His jaw moved slightly. The adjustment of a man who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room and was recalculating. He was not unintelligent. He had built a real business, inherited foundation and all, but constructed genuinely in the years since. He understood negotiation. He understood leverage. What he did not understand, what he had never needed to understand, because his entire life had arranged itself to protect him from needing to, was the particular quality of attention that Park Sung-jin brought to a room. The way he listened to what was not being said. The way he tracked variables that other people forgot were variables. He also did not understand, sitting in that chair with his portfolio and his recalibrating smile, that he had already been assessed and found to be exactly the kind of man that Sung-jin had spent a career learning to manage without sentiment. The meeting continued. Numbers moved across the desk. Projections were offered and declined. Chad tried 3 different approaches to reducing the principal: restructured timeline, partial asset transfer, a development partnership on a Buckhead property that Sung-jin listened to with complete patience and then set aside with 2 words. He was thorough, methodical, and slowly losing ground, and the afternoon light was shifting in the west-facing window behind Sung-jin's head in a way that made Chad increasingly aware that he had arrived expecting to negotiate and was instead being processed. It was into this particular tension that the door opened. She entered the way she always entered rooms, as though the room had been waiting for her without knowing it. The coffee tray was in her hands, 2 cups, a small carafe, the particular domestic competence that she wore like a second costume over the blouse and the trousers, and the deliberate, unhurried movement that made watching her feel like watching something with its own internal gravity. Jade crossed to the desk. She leaned slightly forward to reach the far cup placement, and the light caught the gold pendant at her throat, and the black hair fell forward over her shoulder, and Chad Whitmore stopped talking mid-sentence in a way he was entirely unaware of. She straightened. Her eyes moved briefly to Sung Jin's, a half-second of contact that carried the compressed language of 2 years of proximity. And then she was already turning toward the door. "You trained for that, or were you just born with it?" The words arrived in the room before anyone had fully decided they were going to be said. Jade stopped. She did not turn immediately. There was a pause, very short, very controlled, in which she made several decisions. Then she turned with the smile already in place, warm, steady. The smile of a woman who had heard that sentence in one form or another since she was 17, and had long since developed a complete vocabulary of responses that gave nothing away while appearing to give everything. "I've always been this way, Mr. Whitmore." She picked up the carafe she had deliberately left on the side table. She had seen him look. She had calculated the return. "More coffee?" "Absolutely," he said. His voice had dropped a register, and the way men's voices drop when they have decided something without consulting the better parts of themselves. Jade poured. The coffee steamed. She was completely composed. And Pak Sung-jin, who had gone very still behind his desk, was watching Chad Whitmore's face with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with the negotiation. The dragon on his neck was visible above the open collar. The Audemars Piguet on his wrist caught no light because his wrists were flat on the desk and his hands were too controlled to move. But if you had been watching his fingers, and Jade was watching everything, always, you would have seen them press slightly into the wood. Just slightly. The way pressure is applied when something must not become movement. She knew he was watching. She had known the moment she walked in and felt the particular quality of his attention shift from the negotiation to her. The shift that happened every time she was in the room. The shift he had never acknowledged and she had never named, and they had both lived inside for 23 months like 2 people sharing an apartment with a wall between them that neither was willing to be the first to remove. She picked up the tray. She moved toward the door, and something in her, the part that was tired of the wall, the part that had spent 2 years reading his silences and his half-seconds and his one-word sentences, and had decided that if he would not move, then she would provide a reason. Something in her opened the door for Chad Whitmore's next sentence by not leaving fast enough. She had slowed her pace by exactly the amount required. She was very good at calculating the amount required. "You know," Chad said, to no one in particular, and to her specifically, setting down his coffee cup with the casual ease of a man who had confused tolerance for invitation, "I've been trying to work out what it is about you." His eyes moved over her with the thoroughness of someone inspecting a property he was considering acquiring. "It's the whole thing, isn't it? The whole picture." The room temperature did not change. The air did not shift. Nothing visible happened. But something happened. Jade turned from the door with her hand still on the frame, and she looked at Chad Whitmore with those amber eyes that were completely calm and completely unreadable. And she said, "The whole picture stays right where it is, Mr. Whitmore." A pause, precisely waited. "Is there anything else you need before I let you two get back to it?" It was perfect. It was dismissal dressed in hospitality. and any man with functional perception would have received it as such. Chad Whitmore smiled the smile of someone who had mistaken her composure for modesty, her calm for passivity, and her politeness for the absence of a boundary. "Actually," he said, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the desk, rotating his attention between her and Sung Jin with the confidence of a man performing for an audience he believed was receptive. "I wanted to ask your boss here something." He glanced at Sung Jin, then back to her. "You work hard, right? Long hours, all of this." He gestured vaguely at the office, at her, at the space between them. "Park, what does a woman like that run you a year? Because I'm thinking, whatever it is, the return on investment has got to be Whitmore." Sung Jin's voice was quiet. The word did not raise in volume. It did not need to. It landed in the room with the specific weight of something that should have been heeded immediately and was not. Because Chad Whitmore had lived 44 years in rooms that accommodated him and had no muscle memory for the alternative. "I'm paying you a compliment," he said, turning to Jade again with the smile still running. "I'm saying you're valuable. That's a good thing." He spread his hands. "Name your price for the black girl, Park." The smile widened into something that thought it was charm and was not. "Come on, what's it take to get someone like that in my corner? I'll cut 10% off what I owe you, right now, if you tell me she's free Friday." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of something that had already been decided. Jade's hand was still on the doorframe. She did not look at Chad. She looked at the middle distance between herself and the far wall, and in that look there was something that was not quite stillness. Something that was the held breath before a word is spoken that cannot be taken back. The pause at the edge of a thing you have been circling for 2 years and have finally been given an undeniable reason to stop circling. She turned her head. She looked at Park Sung-jin, and for the first time in 23 months, she did not look at him the way you look at the person you work for. She looked at him the way you look at the person you have been waiting for. His eyes were already on her. They had been on her since Chad had started speaking. The dark eyes that gave nothing, that had spent 2 years managing the precise temperature of every room they entered. Those eyes were giving something now. Something that moved beneath the surface the way fire moves beneath controlled ground. Quiet and total and waiting for the moment the surface gives. She saw it. She had always seen it. She had simply been waiting for him to let her. And Park Sung-jin, who had survived things that would have ended other men, who had built a life on the discipline of not reacting, who had sat in this chair across from people who threatened him with real consequences and felt nothing visible. Park Sung-jin slowly set down the pen he had been holding. The sound it made on the desk was very small. Everything else that followed was not. There is a specific kind of silence that arrives not when nothing is happening, but when everything has already been decided, and the world is simply waiting for the body to catch up with the conclusion. That silence lived in the third-floor office for exactly 4 seconds after the pen touched the desk. 4 seconds in which Chad Whitmore was still smiling, in which the coffee was still steaming in the cup beside his elbow, in which the afternoon light continued its indifferent crawl across the floor, in which Jade Rivers stood at the door with her hand on the frame and her eyes on the man behind the desk. And the man behind the desk had stopped being the version of himself that the world was permitted to see. Chad filled the silence the way men like him always filled silences, with more words. "Look, I'm not trying to offend anybody." He adjusted his posture, a small retreat dressed as ease. "It's a business question. You people do things differently, I get that. I'm just saying. Stand up. 2 words. Sungjin's voice had not changed in volume. It had changed in everything else. The temperature of it, the texture, the specific quality that it carried when it was not performing patience anymore and was simply being what it was underneath. Chad blinked. Excuse me? Stand up, Whitmore. There was a moment, brief, observable, in which Chad processed the instruction, and the instinct to comply with it fought against 44 years of being the man in the room who gave instructions rather than received them. The fight lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then something in the quality of Sungjin's stillness resolved the question without further discussion, and Chad pushed his chair back and stood. He was taller than he had seemed sitting down. It did not help him. Sungjin came around the desk. He did not hurry. He had never needed to hurry in order to arrive somewhere with complete authority. And he did not begin now. He moved around the left side of the desk with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who had already calculated every step between where he was and where he intended to be. And Chad tracked him with eyes that were reassessing something they had assessed incorrectly on the way in. The dragon on his neck was fully visible now. In the direct afternoon light, it was not just a tattoo. It was a declaration. Inked into skin over years and dozens of separate hours of deliberate pain. The kind of marking that men do not acquire accidentally. It moved with the muscle beneath it when Sungjin's jaw tightened, which it did slightly as he crossed the room. Chad took 1 step back, then stopped himself because he was Chad Whitmore, and he did not step back from people in his own... He caught the correction. In other people's offices. Park. If this is about the comment, I was clearly joking. The woman is obviously... Her name, Sungjin said, stopping 3 feet from him, is Ms. Rivers. The correction landed in the room without heat and without ceremony. It was simply true. It was the kind of true that did not require emphasis. Ms. Rivers. Chad repeated it with the slight smile of a man trying to locate the register of a conversation that had stopped fitting any register he knew. Okay. Sure. Look, I came here to settle a number, not to... You came here, Sungjin said, because you owe a debt, and ran out of other options. You sat in that chair and spent 40 minutes trying to reduce a number that is not reducible. And then, he paused, not for effect, for precision. And then you said what you said. It was a joke. It was not a joke. Park, it was an assessment. The voice remained level. That was the part that was frightening. The absolute level of it. The absence of the register that men use when they are losing control. He was not losing control. He had made a decision, and the decision was proceeding. You looked at someone who works in my office, and you placed a value on her as though she were a line item in the portfolio you brought in that case. You used her as a negotiating chip. In front of me. In this office. Chad's smile had become uncertain. It was still technically present on his face, but it had lost its architecture. The confidence that had built it now visibly under structural review. I didn't mean any disrespect to you, if that's... To me. Sungjin said it quietly, and in the 2-word sentence there was something that anyone listening carefully would have heard. The faint, involuntary fracture in a wall that had been maintained for 23 months. You think what you said was a problem because of what it meant to me. Jade, who had not moved from the doorway, heard it. She heard the fracture. She recognized it the way you recognize a sound you have been listening for so long
that it has become part of the silence. And then one day it arrives and you realize the silence had always been made of it. Her hand came down from the doorframe. She took 2 steps back into the room. Neither man looked at her. Chad because he was engaged in the losing end of a conversation that was accelerating beyond his management. And Sung Jin because he could not look at her right now and continue being as controlled as he needed to be for the next 30 seconds. "Let me tell you what is going to happen," Sung Jin said. He was very close to Chad now. Not threatening in the theatrical way, not looming, not performing. Simply close, in the way of a man who does not use proximity for theater, but uses it because proximity is accurate and theater is wasteful. "You are going to leave this office. The debt stays at the original number. You will have my account information by end of business Friday, and you will not return to this building." Chad's jaw worked. The portfolio was still on the desk behind him, forgotten. "You can't just—" "The second thing," Sung Jin continued, as though Chad had not spoken, "is that you will not speak about Ms. Rivers. Not to me, not to anyone in my organization, not in conversation at whatever club you go to on Saturday nights to convince yourself you're the most important man in the room." A pause. Are we clear on both things? There was a long moment. Chad Whitmore was not, at his core, a coward. He was a man who had mistaken a lifetime of privilege for courage, which was a different thing, and the distinction was becoming apparent to him in real time. He looked at the man in front of him, the contained, absolute stillness of him, the tattoo, the dark eyes that had not changed temperature once in the last 4 minutes, and he made a calculation. The calculation came out wrong. "You know what your problem is, Park?" He straightened. The smile came back, but it was different now. Thinner, with an edge that men produce when they feel themselves losing and decide that aggression is the only remaining move. "You've been in this country long enough to have a nice office and a nice suit, and you still think you can tell people like me how things work." He picked up his portfolio from the desk behind him, a gesture of reclamation. "I know people. I make calls. You want to play this hard? We can play it hard. But don't think for 1 second that—" The portfolio hit the floor. It hit the floor because Chad Whitmore's hands were no longer holding it. They were occupied with a more pressing matter, which was that Park Sung Jin had covered the distance between them in 2 steps and taken the lapels of the royal blue 3-piece in one hand with the grip of someone who had done this before. Not in anger, not in chaos, but with the terrible economy of a man for whom this was not a loss of control, but an exercise of it. Chad made a sound that was not words. Sung Jin walked him backward toward the window. It was not fast. It was not frantic. It was the methodical, purposeful movement of someone executing a decision that had been made the moment the other man said what he said. A decision that had been postponed only as long as the conversation required, and not 1 second longer. The window was already open. It had been open since 2 o'clock because the air conditioning on the 3rd floor ran warm in the afternoons, and Sung Jin had developed the habit of opening it without thinking about what it meant to have a window open on the 3rd floor when men like Chad Whitmore came to visit. He would later decide he had not been entirely unconscious of it. Chad's back hit the window frame. His eyes went wide, not with the staged terror of a man performing fear, but with the real biological terror of a body that has received accurate information about its situation and is responding without consulting the ego. Wait, Park! Sung Jin? The voice came from behind him. Not a shout, not a command. 2 syllables, spoken with the particular weight of a name used for the first time in the way it was meant to be used. He stopped. Not because the name stopped him,
or not only because of that. Because of the voice that carried it. Because in 23 months, she had said Mr. Park. She had said Sir. She had said the precise professional address that the situation required. And she had never, not once, said his name the way it was said now. As though it belonged to her. As though she had been holding it in her mouth for 2 years, waiting for the moment it would mean what it meant when she finally released it. He turned his head. Only his head. She was standing in the center of the office, 3 feet from the desk, the coffee tray set aside somewhere he hadn't noticed, her hands at her sides and her amber eyes on him with an expression that was not fear and was not pleading. It was something much more disorienting than either of those things. It was knowing. She looked at him the way someone looks at you when they have understood you completely and have decided to stay anyway, and are only now letting you see that they decided a long time ago. "He's not worth it," she said. Her voice was steady. The gold pendant caught the light. "He's really not." Sungjin looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to Chad Whitmore, who was gripping the window frame with both hands and breathing in the rapid, shallow way of a man who has received an education he did not register for. And in those 3 seconds, something had shifted. Not the decision. The decision was made. It had been made before she spoke. But the reason for it had clarified into something he could no longer pretend was professional. Could no longer file under protection of assets or management of a hostile variable. It was not those things. It was simpler than those things. It was older than those things. He looked at Chad Whitmore one final time, and what Chad saw in his face was not rage. Rage would have been manageable. Rage was familiar. Rage was the thing that men like Chad had lawyers for. What Chad saw was something quieter and more absolute. The expression of a man who has measured a situation against something that matters to him and found the situation entirely insufficient. He released one lapel. He kept the other. He turned toward the window with Chad still in his grip, and with the specific, unhurried motion of someone who has calculated the drop and found it acceptable. 3 floors to the maintenance annex roof, 1 story below. A fall that would hurt and would not kill, which was the only calculation that mattered. He pushed. Chad Whitmore went through the open window with a sound that was less a scream and more the involuntary vocalization of a body in freefall, the blue suit catching the afternoon light for 1 bright second before he landed on the green synthetic turf of the maintenance terrace below with the impact of something large and previously overconfident meeting accurate consequence. The sound of the landing traveled up through the building's walls. Then there was silence. Real silence this time. The silence that follows an irreversible thing. The window was open and the warm Atlanta air came through it. And somewhere below, Chad Whitmore was making sounds that confirmed he was alive, and the office was very still. Sungjin stood at the window with his hands on the frame. His breathing was controlled. It had not become uncontrolled at any point. This was either a measure of his discipline or evidence of exactly how long the decision had been sitting inside him, waiting for a reason that was undeniable enough to justify it. And the answer was probably both. He did not look at the window. He looked at the room behind him. He looked at her. The room held them the way rooms hold things that have finally happened after a long time of almost happening. The window was open behind him. The warm air moved through it and lifted the edge of the scattered documents on the desk, the folders she had prepared, the numbers that no longer mattered, The portfolio that Chad Whitmore had dropped and would not be returning for. And the papers settled again without going anywhere. The way things do when the disturbance has passed and the room is reassembling itself around what remains. What remained was the two of them. Sung Jin turned from the window slowly. His hands came away from the frame. He straightened the cuffs of his jacket with two precise movements, right, then left. The automatic restoration of order in the exterior when the interior had just done something that could not be restored or undone or filed away under any category he had previously maintained. Jade had not moved from the center of the room. She was watching him with those amber eyes that had cataloged him for 23 months. Every silence, every half-second, every sentence that stopped one word before it would have said too much. And what was in them now was not surprise. It was the specific expression of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and is only now being given permission to acknowledge it. He crossed the room toward his desk, not toward her. He picked up the pen he had set down, that small, deliberate sound that had preceded everything, and he placed it in the pen holder with the care of a man who needs to do something with his hands while his mind completes a transition it did not plan for today. "You should go home," he said. His voice was even. It was always even. It was the most consistent thing about him, and the thing she had spent 2 years learning to read beneath. The way you learn to read weather beneath a sky that presents the same shade of blue, regardless of what is building underneath it. "No," she said. One word. Quietly delivered. Absolute. He looked up from the desk. She had not moved. Her hands were still at her sides. The blouse was still precise, the trousers still perfect, the pendant still catching light at her throat. She looked exactly as she had looked when she walked in an hour ago, and she looked entirely different from how she had looked when she walked in an hour ago. And both of these things were true simultaneously, and he understood both of them. "Jade, you said my name like that," she said. "Twice today. The way you say it when you think I'm not analyzing the way you say it." A pause. "I always analyze the way you say it." He was quiet. Outside, distantly, there was movement below the window. Voices, the sound of someone calling for assistance, the predictable administrative aftermath of a man in a blue suit having arrived unexpectedly on the maintenance terrace. It would be handled. His people handled things. That was the architecture of the life he had built, and it had never failed to operate, and it would operate now without his attention. For the first time in 4 years, something in this building was happening without his attention, because his attention was entirely, irrevocably, and without remainder, somewhere else. "This is not simple," he said. It was the same thing he had said to himself at the window 2 hours ago, before she walked in with the folder, before any of this. He said it now because it was still true, and because it was the only honest resistance he had left. "I know what you do," she said. "I've known since the 3rd month." She watched him process that. The manifests. The visitors who arrive without appointments and leave without paperwork. The phone calls you take in the stairwell when you think I can't hear the language shift. She tilted her head slightly, and the black hair moved over her shoulder. "I know what this office is, Sungjin. I stayed anyway." The name again. His name. Not Mr. Park, not Sir, not the professional address that had maintained the wall between them for 23 months. His name in her voice, with the weight she had placed in it. The weight of a decision that had been made long before today and had simply been waiting for the wall to come down. He looked at her across the office. The light was changing, late afternoon moving toward early evening, the gold of it deepening through the open window. In that light, her skin had the warm, luminous quality that it always had in the late afternoon, the tone that made the gold of the pendant look like it had been chosen for her specifically, which perhaps it had been. He had never asked about the pendant. He had spent 23 months not asking about things he wanted to know. "Why?" he said. It was a real question, not rhetorical. He needed the answer with an honesty that surprised him, the way genuine need always surprised him when it surfaced through the managed life he had constructed around it. She walked toward him then. Not fast, not with the purposeful office stride that he knew, the clean rhythm of heels on marble that he had memorized without choosing to. Differently, with the kind of pace that means I have decided, and I am no longer pretending I haven't. She stopped on the other side of the desk, close enough that the pendant caught the light between them. "Because you look at me like I'm the only variable in every room that you didn't calculate," she said. "And you've been furious about it since the first week. And I found that—" She paused. Something moved in her expression. Warm, certain. The smile that wasn't the professional one. The smile he had never been the recipient of directly before, only ever the observer of from a careful distance. I found that completely impossible to walk away from. He was still. The particular stillness that was not absence, but the opposite of absence. Presence so concentrated it took up all the space. "I threw a man out of a window," he said. "Third floor," she replied. "You knew the drop. He's going to be angry and sore, and his suit is destroyed. And he's going to call a lawyer who works for you. And he's not going to do anything." She held his gaze without flinching. "You were precise about it. You're precise about everything." The smile deepened fractionally. "Including, I think, how you feel about me. Very precise. Very contained. For a very long time." Something in his face shifted. The mask, not gone. It was not capable of going entirely. It was structural to him, built into the bone over too many years to simply dissolve. But behind it, or beneath it, something that the mask had been managing for 23 months moved with the slow, irreversible momentum of something that has waited long enough. He came around the desk. He moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided, and he stopped in front of her with 6 inches of warm afternoon air between them. And he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 2 years, with the professional distance removed, which meant she was finally seeing what the distance had been containing. And what it had been containing was considerable. His hand came up. The same hand that had, 10 minutes ago, removed Chad Whitmore from the negotiating table and from the building by the most direct route available. It came up slowly, the way he had touched the gold cord at her throat earlier that afternoon, with the careful precision of a man who does not touch things carelessly and is very aware that this is not a thing he is allowed to touch carelessly. He touched the pendant, the thin gold chain. His fingers were warm against her skin. "The moon," he said quietly. He had wanted to ask about it for 23 months. "You always wear it." "My grandmother gave it to me," she said. Her voice was steady, but her breath had changed slightly. Barely, the smallest shift, the kind that only someone paying the quality of attention he paid to her would notice. "She said it was for the women who do their best work in the dark, when no one's watching." He looked at the pendant, then at her face. "I was watching,"
he said. I know, she said. I know you were.
The 6 inches became nothing. It was not dramatic in the way that the previous 40 minutes had been dramatic. No sudden movement, no sound that the rest of the building would hear. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the quiet, total collapse of a distance that had been maintained with enormous effort for a very long time. And when it finally closed, it felt not like an explosion, but like a pressure releasing. Like something that had been held underwater finally being allowed to surface. His hand moved from the pendant to her jaw. Careful, the way you are careful with things you have thought about for long enough that the reality of them requires handling. And she leaned into it by a degree that was not accidental. And the afternoon light continued to move through the open window as though nothing had occurred. Which was its job, and it was doing it without comment. They stood like that in the changed room, in the quiet that follows the irreversible thing, in the last of the afternoon gold. Outside, the voices below the window had organized themselves into the beginning of a solution. A car would arrive. A story would be managed. Chad Whitmore would be escorted somewhere that was not this building, and the debt would remain at the original number, and the bronze plaque outside would continue to read Sung Global Imports in letters that told no one anything useful, and the building on Clearwater Drive would continue to look from the outside exactly as it had always looked. Unremarkable, contained, giving nothing away. From the inside, something had permanently changed. She pulled back by an inch. Not away, just back enough to see his face, which she had been reading for 23 months, and was now reading with nothing between her and it for the first time. No professional register, no managed distance, nothing but the man. You're going to want to say something practical now, she said. Something about complications, about the people you work with and the life you have, and the reasons this... Yes, he said. She waited. All of those things are true, he said. His voice was quiet and even, and no longer performing evenness. It was simply how he spoke, and she had known that for a long time. The complications are real. The life is what it is. None of that changed in the last hour. No, she agreed. And none of it, he said, is the thing I am thinking about right now. The smile that crossed her face then was not the professional one, not the social one, not the one she had deployed on Chad Whitmore like a precise and calibrated tool. It was something else entirely. Something that had not been for the office, or for a visitor, or for the management of a room. Something that was, as far as she could tell, entirely involuntary. She had not shown him that one before. He looked at it like a man who has been handed something he was not certain he deserved and is not going to make the mistake of putting it down. The people downstairs, she said softly, are going to talk. They already talk, he said. They have for months. She blinked. About us? About the way I say your name, he said. Apparently I am not as precise as I believed. A sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, something lighter than that. Something that belonged to relief and warmth, and the particular release of 2 years of held breath finding its way out at last. She brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to her mouth, and he watched her with the expression of a man discovering that this specific thing, this sound, this moment, was something he intended to be in the room for as many times as it occurred, for the remainder of whatever came next. Whatever came next was complicated. It had always been complicated, and would become more so. The life he had built was not the kind of life that simplified itself for emotional convenience. And she knew that, had always known that, had signed the lease on that knowledge the day she read the manifests in month 3 and decided to stay. But complicated and impossible were different things. He understood that now, in a way he had been avoiding understanding for 23 months. Because impossible had been the useful word. The word that kept the wall standing, that kept the professional distance operable, that allowed him to sit in the same room as her every day and behave as though the room were level. The room had never been level. He had simply been very good at standing in it as though it were. "So," she said, the sound of her still warm in the air between them. "What happens now?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the light had gone fully gold, the particular late afternoon Atlanta gold that turned everything it touched into something that looked more significant than it was. Or perhaps accurately significant. Perhaps the light was simply being honest about what it found when it came through the window and saw the two of them standing in the room where everything had finally stopped being contained. "Now," he said, "I am going to close the window. And then I am going to call someone to manage the situation downstairs. And then..." He paused. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the space a man takes when he is saying something true for the first time and wants to say it with the weight it deserves. "And then I would like to take you to dinner. Somewhere that is not this building." She looked at him. 23 months of reading him looked at him. "That's very practical," she said. "I am a practical man." "You just threw someone out a window." "That was also practical," he said. "The window was open." The laugh that came from her this time was complete and unguarded and filled the changed room from wall to wall. And Park Sung-jin stood in the middle of it with the expression of a man who has not laughed in longer than he can accurately calculate, and is not laughing now, but is holding the sound of someone else's laugh with both hands, like something he has no intention of putting down. He crossed to the window. He closed it. The latch turned with a clean, final click. Below, on the maintenance terrace, a car had arrived and 2 men were helping Chad Whitmore to his feet. His blue suit was torn at one knee. His portfolio was still on the 3rd floor. His lawyer would not answer for another 40 minutes. He would spend that time sitting on the synthetic turf in the fading Atlanta afternoon, making the slow and humbling acquaintance of the consequences of having walked into the wrong room and addressed the wrong woman in front of the wrong man. He had come in with leverage. He left with a lesson. The debt remained. It always remained. And in the 3rd floor office with the closed window and the last of the gold light moving across the floor, Jade Rivers picked up the small caramel leather bag from the chair where she had left it at the start of the afternoon, and she settled the strap over her shoulder, and she looked at Park Sung-jin across the room with the clarity of a woman who has known what she wanted for a long time, and has finally, after 23 months of patience and precision and very deliberate provocation, then given the room to want it out loud. "I know a place," she said. "Better than wherever you were thinking." He reached for his jacket on the back of his chair, settled it onto his shoulders. The dragon on his neck moved as he adjusted the collar. "Then you choose," he said. She walked to the door. She opened it. She paused with her hand on the frame, the same frame she had stood at an hour ago when everything was still being held. And she looked back at him over her shoulder with that smile. The real one, the involuntary one that he had decided he was not going to stop being in the room for. "I already did," she said.
months ago.
He turned off the office light. They walked out together into the corridor, her heels marking the familiar rhythm on the marble floor, his steps steady beside hers. And behind them, the third-floor office settled into the quiet dark of an ordinary evening in an unremarkable building on Clearwater Drive. The scattered papers, the closed window, the empty chairs, the bronze plaque outside that told no one anything useful. Inside, for the first time in 23 months, there was nothing left being held.
The wall was down, and the room, finally, was level.
The problem begins when confusion becomes your normal. When you no longer know whether you are being loved or simply being kept around. When you start normalizing signs that hurt, silence that drains you, and doubt that steals your peace. If that spoke to you, I left a path to help you recognize this pattern sooner, stop abandoning yourself, and trust yourself again. You can access it now through the QR code on the screen, the link in the description, or the pinned comment.
If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been in a room where someone reduced you to a price tag? Where your worth, your dignity, your whole self was treated like something to be negotiated? And the one person you needed to speak up stayed silent just a little too long? And have you ever loved something quietly, from a careful distance, telling yourself it was complicated, telling yourself the wall made sense, until the moment came when keeping it standing cost more than letting it fall? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, hidden love, and the kind of justice that arrives through an open window, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.